Welcome back to part two. Welcome to part two. Let's do this. I just lined up a cool potential guest host for one of these future ones, a longtime buddy of mine who's got a lot of interesting points, but he's probably going to jump on the hypernormalization videos. You'll notice centuries of self and hypernormalization. There's a common thread between them. Obviously, while they're directed by the same person, but also conceptually. All right, let's get back into this. So I'm going to have different clothes probably in the different videos, different day. I recorded the first part last night, but my wife and daughter are gone to the nursery to get, like the plant nursery to get some stuff for the backyard, and we'll be gone for a while, so I'm going to do the next part. Let's do this.
But while Bernays became rich and powerful in America, in Vienna his uncle was facing disaster. Like much of Europe, Vienna was suffering an economic crisis and massive inflation, which wiped out all of Freud's savings. Facing bankruptcy, he wrote to his nephew for help. Bernays responded by arranging for Freud's works to be published for the first time in America, and began to send his uncle precious dollars, which Freud kept secretly in a foreign bank account.
I rewinded it like a minute.
He was Freud's agent, if you will, to get his books published. Well, of course, once the books were being published, Eddie couldn't help himself but promote these books, see that everybody read them, make them controversial, emphasize the fact that, do you know what Freud says about sex and what he says cigarettes are a symbol of and so on and so forth? How do you suppose all those stories got out? Certainly the academics weren't spreading these around the country. Eddie Bernays was. Then, when Freud became accepted, well then, of course, to go to a client and say, well, Uncle Siggy, see, then that had some cachet. But notice there, first Eddie created Uncle Siggy in the U.S., made him acceptable, secondly, and thirdly, then capitalized on Uncle Siggy. Typical Bernays performance.
Bernays also suggested that...
Right, when he's saying made Freud, he's obviously talking about, like, reputationally, right? Like, he didn't make up Freud. But it is interesting, right? It's interesting that Freud's the most popular psychologist ever, easily, right? And that his nephew was kind of like the king of propaganda or public relations, literally created that word. And it's just the history here is so interesting and how it relates to World War II, which we're about to get to, and why this part of the episode gets dark at points. And there's some I should put this as a forewarning that there's some tough video footage, and because there's a tough aspect of this history, specifically in how it relates with Nazi Germany and what happened there.
Freud promote himself in the United States. He proposed his uncle write an article for Cosmopolitan, a magazine that Bernays represented, entitled A Woman's Mental Place in the Home. Freud was furious. Such an idea, he said, was unthinkable. It was vulgar, and anyway, he hated America. Freud was now becoming increasingly pessimistic about human beings. In the mid-20s, he retreated in the summers to the Alps, sometimes staying in an old hotel, the Pension Moritz in Berchtesgaden. It is now a ruin. Freud began to write about group behavior, about how easily the unconscious aggressive forces in human beings could be triggered when they were in crowds. Freud believed he had underestimated the aggressive instincts in human beings. They were far more dangerous than he had originally thought.
After World War I, Freud was basically a pessimist. He felt that man is an impossible creature, a very, very sadistic and bad species, and did not believe that man can be improved. Man is a ferocious animal, the most ferocious animal that exists. They enjoy torturing and killing, and he didn't like man.
The publication of Freud's works in America had an extraordinary effect on journalists and intellectuals in the 1920s. What fascinated and frightened them was the picture Freud painted of submerged, dangerous forces lurking just under the surface of modern society. Forces that could erupt easily to produce the frenzied mob which had the power to destroy even governments. It was this they believed had happened in Russia.
Look at that footage.
To many, this meant that one of the guiding principles of mass democracy was wrong. The belief that human beings could be trusted to make decisions on a rational basis. The leading political writer, Walter Lippmann, argued that if human beings were in reality driven by unconscious, irrational forces, then it was necessary to rethink democracy. What was needed was a new elite who could manage what he called the bewildered herd. This would be done through psychological techniques that would control the unconscious feelings of the masses.
So here you have Walter Lippmann, probably the most influential political thinker in the United States, who is essentially saying that the basic mechanism of the mass mind is unreason, is irrationality, is animality. He believes that the mob in the street, which is how he sees ordinary people, are people who are driven not by their minds but by their spinal cords. The notion of kind of animal drives, unconscious instinctual drives lurking beneath the surface.
Think about that. I should put that quote on for you if you're taking notes here. It was something like, or you might want to back it up. I can just do it. Is that what he said? Not from the mind.
Forces, then it was necessary to rethink democracy. What was needed was a new elite who could manage what he called the bewildered herd. This would be done through psychological techniques that would control the unconscious feelings of the masses.
So here you have Walter Lippmann, probably the most influential political thinker in the United States, who is essentially saying that the basic mechanism of the mass mind is unreason, is irrationality, is animality. He believes that the mob in the street, which is how he sees ordinary people, are people who are driven not by their minds but by their spinal cords. The notion of kind of animal drives, unconscious.
I think what that means, right? That it basically what he's saying is people, the herd's driven by irrational emotion. They're not driven by logical reason. They're not driven by cognition. They're driven by irrational emotion.
Instinctual drives lurking beneath the surface of civilization. And so they started looking towards psychological science as a way of understanding the mechanisms by which the popular mind works, specifically with the goal of figuring out how to understand how to apply those mechanisms to strategies for social control.
Edward Bernays was fascinated by Lippmann's arguments and also saw a way to promote himself by using them. In the 1920s, he began to write a series of books which argued that he had developed the very techniques Lippmann was calling for. By stimulating people's inner desires and then sating them with consumer products, he was creating a new way to manage the irrational force of the masses. He called it the engineering of consent.
Democracy, to my father, was a wonderful concept, but I don't think he felt that all those publics out there had reliable judgment, and that they very easily might vote for the wrong man or want the wrong thing, so that they had to be guided from above. It's enlightened despotism in a sense. You appeal to their desires and their unrecognized longings, that sort of thing. That you can tap into their deepest desires or their deepest fears and use that to your own purposes.
And then, in 1928, a president came to power who agreed with Bernays. President Hoover was the first politician to articulate the idea that consumerism had become the central motor of American life. After his election, he told a group of advertisers and public relations men, "You have taken over the job of creating desire and have transformed people into constantly moving happiness machines. machines which have become the key to economic progress. What was beginning to emerge in the 1920s was a new idea of how to run mass democracy. At its heart was the consuming self, which not only made the economy work, but was happy and docile, and so created a stable society.
Both Bernays and Littman's concept of managing.
Just think about that for a sec, because the majority of the people that ever see this, I know some of you didn't take the psych courses with me before, but I think something like 2/3 of this group have taken developmental psych with me. And the reason I pause is because think about in that course, we talk about how what we call psychological or self develops in these kind of stages or in these in this progression. We talked about like the categorical self and the emotional self and the social self and the subjective self and the objective self and all this stuff. They're saying like, oh, there's this consuming self. So just the language is so important.
The masses takes the idea of democracy and it turns it into a palliative. It turns it into giving people some kind of feel-good medication that will respond to an immediate pain or an immediate yearning, but will not alter the objective circumstances one iota. I mean, democracy really, the idea of democracy at its heart was about changing the relations of power that had governed the world for so long. And Bernays' concept of democracy was one of maintaining the relations of power, even if it meant that one needed to sort of stimulate the psychological lives of the public. And in fact, in his mind, that was what was necessary. That if you can keep stimulating the irrational self, then leadership can basically go on doing what it wants to do.
Bernays now became one of the central figures in a business elite that dominated American society and politics in the 1920s. He also became extremely rich and lived in a suite of rooms in one of New York's most expensive hotels, where he gave frequent parties.
Oh my goodness. He had a home in the corner suite of the Sherry Netherland Hotel. And here's this wonderful suite with all these windows looking out on Central Park and across at the plaza and on the square. And he would use this place to hold a soiree. The mayor would come. All the media leaders would come, the political leaders, the business leaders, the people in the arts. I mean, it was a who's who. People wanted to know Eddie Bernays because, you know, he himself became a sort of a famous man, a sort of a magician who could make these things happen.
He knows everybody. He knows the mayor and he knows the senator and he calls politicians on the telephone as if he did get literally a high or a bang out of doing what he did. And that's fine, but it can be a little hard on the people around you, especially when you make other people feel stupid. People who worked for him were stupid, and children were stupid, and if people did things in a way that he wouldn't have done them, they were stupid. It was a word that he used over and over and over, dope and stupid.
And the masses?
They were stupid.
Look at some of this footage.
But Bernays' power was about to be destroyed dramatically, and by a type of human irrationality he could do nothing to control. At the end of October 1929, Bernays organised a huge national event to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the invention of the light bulb. President Hoover, the leaders of major corporations, and bankers like John D. Rockefeller were all summoned by Bernays to celebrate the power of American business. But even as they gathered, news came through that shares on the New York Stock Exchange were beginning to fall catastrophically. Throughout the 1920s, speculators had borrowed billions of dollars. The banks had promoted the idea that this was a new era where market crashes were a thing of the past. But they were wrong. What was about to happen was the biggest stock market crash in history. Investors had panicked and begun to sell in a blind, relentless fury that no reassurance by bankers or politicians could halt. And on the 29th of October 1929, the market collapsed. The effect of the crash on the American economy was disastrous. Faced with recession and unemployment, millions of American workers stopped buying goods they didn't need. The consumer boom that Bernays had done so much to engineer disappeared, and he and the profession of public relations fell from favour. Bernays' brief moment of power seemed to be over. The effect of the Wall Street crash on Europe was also catastrophic. It intensified the growing economic and political crisis in the new democracies. In both Germany and Austria, there were violent street battles between the armed wings of different political parties. Against this backdrop, Freud, who was suffering from cancer of the jaw, retreated yet again to the Alps. He wrote a book called Civilization and Its Discontents. It was a powerful attack on the idea that civilization was an expression of human progress. Instead, Freud argued, civilization had actually been constructed to control the dangerous animal forces inside human beings. What was implicit in Freud's argument was that the ideal of individual freedom, which was at the heart of democracy, was impossible. Human beings could never be allowed to truly express themselves because it was too dangerous. They must always be controlled and would thus always be discontent.
Man doesn't want to be civilized, and he is, civilization brings discontent, but it's necessary to survival. Otherwise he couldn't survive. So he must be discontent, because this would be the only way to keep him within limits.
But what did Freud think about the idea of the equality of man?
He didn't believe in it.
We had 32 parties, and Hitler said, before those parties don't vanish, there is no Germany. That's true. You can't have 32 parties. And so they felt this one person will put an end to this comedy.
Freud was not alone in his pessimism. Politicians like Adolf Hitler emerged from a growing despair in the 1920s about democracy. The Nazis were convinced that democracy was dangerous because it unleashed a selfish individualism, but didn't have the means to control it. Hitler's party, the National Socialists, stood in elections, promising in their propaganda that they would abandon democracy because of the chaos and unemployment it led to.
Die Parteien versprachen den Himmel auf Erden.
In March 1933, the National Socialists were elected to power in Germany, and they set out to create a society that would control human beings in a different way. One of their first acts was to take control of business. The planning of production would in future be done by the state. The free market was too unstable, as the crash in America had proved. Workers' leisure time was also planned by the state through a new organization called Strength Through Joy. One of its mottos was service, not self.
Service, not self.
But the Nazis did not see this as a return to an old form of autocratic control. It was a new alternative to democracy, in which the feelings and the desires of the masses would still be central, but they would be channeled in such a way as to bind the nation together. The chief exponent of this was Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda.
Es mag gut sein, Macht zu besitzen, die auf Gewehren ruht. Besser aber und beglückender ist es, das Herz eines Volkes zu gewinnen und es auch zu behalten.
Goebbels organized huge rallies whose function, he said, was to forge the mind of the nation into a unity of thinking, feeling and desire. One of his inspirations, he told an American journalist, was the writings of Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays. In his work on crowd psychology, Freud had described how the frightening irrationality inside human beings could emerge in such groups. The deep, what he called libidinal forces of desire, are given up to the leader, while the aggressive instincts are unleashed on those outside the group. Freud wrote this as a warning, but the Nazis were deliberately encouraging these forces because they believed they could master and control them.
Like such a corruption of Freud's ideas, and that's why this is important to understand the depth of this, and like how Bernays' kind of work showed this idea of like the same things, same understanding of people that you can use to therapeutically heal them can be used to manipulate and for all kinds of evils.
Well, Freud was saying that masses are bound by libidinal forces. They love each other and delegate their ideas and their feelings to the chap on top.
What are libidinal forces? What are libidinal forces?
Well, forces of love.
Not hate.
No, hate is delegated to the others outside.
I could see from afar, looking up Wilhelmstraße towards Unter den Linden, how those 100,000 of people, when they passed Hitler, they just became completely delirious. They began to shout these cries I will never get out of my ears. Heil, Sieg, Heil.
With all the horrors of World War II, an important lesson that can't get lost is the role of mind control, but not just mind control, like group psychosis.
Demented. And here I got confirmation how those irrational forces, uncontrollable forces in Germany, in the Germans, had erupted, had broken out, were running riot, were departing, marching on.
And in America too, democracy was under threat.
Let me just move. Sorry, let me move all my stuff off. This movie's been compiled for the training purposes by the FBI from film footage supplied by various news media and law enforcement agencies. This film was taken at the scenes of actual riots and disorderly assemblies. Interesting.
From the force of the angry mob. The effect of the stock market crash had been disastrous. There was growing violence as an angry population took out their frustration on the corporations who were seen to have caused this disaster. Then, in 1932, a new president was elected who was also going to use the power of the state to control the free market. But his aim was not to destroy democracy, but to strengthen it. And to do this, he was going to develop a new way of dealing with the masses.
I am prepared, under my constitutional duty, to recommend the measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. But in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power.
It was the start of what would become known as the New Deal. Roosevelt assembled a group of young technocrats and planners in Washington. He told them that their job was to plan and run giant new industrial projects for the good of the nation. Roosevelt was convinced that the stock market crash had shown that laissez-faire capitalism could no longer run modern industrial economies. It had become the job of government. Big business was horrified.
I hope that's cool for you, how I'm using the banners. I'm trying to just, like, if there's keywords that you might want to be noting, I'm trying to kind of use it for that function. I'm recording this in the same kind of software that you would do like a live stream podcast, even though there's, keep saying, amount of viewers at the top is 0. But, you know, I'm making this for my future NU digital classroom. Let's keep doing it.
But the New Deal attracted the admiration of the Nazis,
15
especially Joseph Goebbels.
Yeah, Goebbels. So think of Goebbels as like one of the key propagandists in this like kind of pre-World War II. We're almost getting into World War II at this point, I think.
In Amerika mit dem allergrößten positiven Interesse. Und wir sind aus der festen Überzeugung, dass Präsident Roosevelt und seine Berater auf dem richtigen Wege sind. Es handelt sich in der Tat um das größte wirtschaftliche und soziale Problem aller Zeiten. Die vielen Millionen Arbeitslosen, die ihre Plätze an den Maschinen und in den Kontoren verloren haben, wieder an ihre alten Arbeitsstellen zurückzuführen. Das kann nicht allein der privaten Initiative überlassen werden. Ausschlaggebend ist, dass die öffentliche Hand mit positiven Maßnahmen eingreift.
But although Roosevelt, like the Nazis, was trying to organize society in a different way, unlike the Nazis, he believed that human beings were rational and could be trusted to take an active part in government. Roosevelt believed it was possible...
See how they had all those squares making up the flag and then they turned them and it was all Roosevelt's face? That was an interesting... See, this... Why I like these Adam Curtis documentaries is he tells an interesting story by like this combination of interviews, old footage, and then his narration. And I just think he does like a great job tying together things that you're not really going to find other places. You'll find the pieces of it, but not the web connecting it.
To explain his policies to ordinary Americans and take into account their opinions. To do this, he was helped by the new ideas of an American social scientist called George Gallup.
Gallup, yeah.
Favorite reading of New Deal Washington, the survey of U.S. public opinion. From offices at Princeton, New Jersey, a famed statistician, Dr. George Gallup, tells Washington from week to week what the nation is thinking. And in New York, Fortune magazine's analyst, Elmo Roper, compiles for publication a continuous record of the nation's approval or disapproval of how the country is being run.
Gallup and Roper rejected Bernays' view that human beings were at the mercy of unconscious forces and so needed to be controlled. Their system of opinion polling was based on the idea that people could be trusted to know what they wanted. They argued that one could measure and predict the opinions and behaviour of the public if one asked strictly factual questions and avoided manipulating their emotions.
Well, how about this one? Do you think Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal has been bad for the nation in general?
No, that question's loaded.
So think about... So what this... It sounds like a straightforward question, but it's actually really deep because it's saying, like, are people actually rational? Like, if you could figure out how people think and then use that model of how they think to predict things, would you be right? Like, are people actually using that? Or are they just kind of emotionally responsive to different kinds of situations and stuff, right? Like, are we rational creatures, or are we... And this is... They're kind of... Obviously, we're some kind of dynamic interconnection between rationality and emotionality, but this is at a point where they're sort of arguing this. Like, should we market to people's thinking or to their, in Bernays' language, these instinctual, underlying unconscious tendencies, patterns and ways of thought and experiences and fears and desires and attractions and impulses?
Automatically suggests an answer. Well, how about this? Is your present feeling toward President Roosevelt one of general approval or general disapproval? That's better.
Prior to scientific polling, the view of many people was that you couldn't trust public opinion. It was irrational, that it was ill-informed, chaotic, unruly, and so forth. And so that opinion should be dismissed. But with scientific polling, I think it established very clearly that people are rational, that they do make good decisions, and this offers democracy a chance to be truly informed by the public, giving everybody a voice in the way the country is run. I know my father wouldn't necessarily...
Like I said, at deep level, it's really asking, like, do people actually know what they want and what's good for them? Or do we just want to think that people know what they want? Like, are people as rational, or do we just like to think that we're rational? And that exists at both like an individual and at a group society level. Is it, and this is kind of the idea, right? Is it rationality, or is it the facsimile or the appearance, the fake appearance that seems like a real manifestation of it?
They say the voice of the public is the voice of God, but he did feel very much that the voice of the people is a rational voice and should be heard.
What Roosevelt was doing was forging a new connection between the masses and politicians. No longer were they irrational consumers who were managed by sating their desires. Instead, they were sensible citizens who could take part in the governing of the country. In 1936, Roosevelt stood for re-election. He promised further control over big business. To the corporations, it was the beginning of a dictatorship.
Roosevelt interferes with private enterprise and is running the country into debt for generations to come. The way to get recovery is to let business alone.
But Roosevelt was triumphantly re-elected.
It looks, my friends, like a real landslide this time. So please let me thank you again and tell you that I hope to see you all very soon and bid you an affectionate good night.
Faced with this, business now decided to fight back, to regain power in America. At the heart of the battle would be Edward Bernays and the profession he had invented, public relations.
Following that election, business people start to get together and start to carry on discussions, primarily in private, and they start talking to each other about the need to sort of carry on ideological warfare against the New Deal and to sort of reassert the sort of connectedness between the idea of democracy on the one hand and the idea of privately owned business on the other. And so, under the umbrella of an organization which still exists, which is called the National Association of Manufacturers, and whose membership included all of the major corporations of the United States, a campaign is launched explicitly designed to create emotional attachments between the public and big business. It's Bernays' techniques being used on a grand scale. I mean, totally.
General Motors' Parade of Progress, traveling the high roads and by roads of America, bringing to millions of Americans in their own hometown the fascinating story behind modern industry.
The campaign set out to show dramatically that it was business, not politicians, who had created modern America.
Better mode of living for all of us.
Bernays was an advisor to General Motors, but he was no longer alone. The industry he had founded now flourished as hundreds of public relations advisors organized a vast campaign.
I guess you can talk about the world.
They not only used advertisements and billboards, but managed to insinuate their message into the editorial pages of the newspapers. It became a bitter fight. In response to the campaign, the government made films that warned of the unscrupulous manipulation of the press by big business. And the central villain was the new figure of the public relations man.
They tried to achieve their ends by working entirely behind the scenes, corrupting and deceiving the public.
The aims of such groups may be either good or bad, so far as the public interest is concerned, but their methods are a grave danger to democratic institutions.
The films also showed how the responsible citizen could monitor the press themselves.
Oh, this is awesome.
They could create a chart that analyzed the reporting for signs of hidden bias.
So look at that. So they're like, okay, this channel, they're doing something. This seems a little bit conservative, or this seems a little bit democratic or whatever. How frequently, what direction is it, what day of the week? They're like basically taking stats on the news. This is like a great approach to digital literacy. You know, you can tell, you can almost, I don't know how you do it nowadays. You could do it with a similar kind of table, but they're doing it with probably sitting down with a newspaper, their local newspaper. It'd be an awesome exercise, actually. It actually just gave me an idea. But this is basically, that's how you would do it to try to establish bias. You would have to look at frequency, the direction of the bias. You can see there it says like favorable or unfavorable, right? They talked about some issue. Trump, is it, how often? Is it every time negative or sometimes positive? That's interesting to know about whatever it is, right? I just said Trump because that's something controversial, but now I'm probably gonna get this video flagged just because I said his name. But yeah, if you see like my point isn't political, my point is metapolitical, that it's actually about understanding that every side's biased, and every side is putting spin. And that doesn't mean that every side is invalid. It means that, well, you need to, so they think, literally chart out the spin.
But such earnest instruction was to be no match for the powerful imagination of Edward Bernays.
Edward Bernays. The name of the day.
He was about to help create a vision of the utopia that free market capitalism would build in America if it was unleashed. In 1939, New York hosted the World's Fair.
Here you go.
Edward Bernays was a central advisor. He insisted that the theme be the link between democracy and American business.
Think about that. So
Human
they have
beings,
this,
and use them to manipulate the city.
Oh, I think I got it back. Okay, sorry about that. But what he was wanting to do is link this idea of the American consumer and this idea of a prosperous future. Those are the same. Those are the same. Keep saying them in the same sentence. Keep saying them in the same sentence. You heard it there. They said he insisted on that being the theme of the World Fair. Everyone's going to be looking at America.
And the central exhibit was a vast working model of America's future, constructed by the General Motors Corporation.
To my father, the World's Fair was an opportunity to keep the status quo, that is, capitalism in a democracy. Democracy and capitalism, that marriage, right, linking, just like that. He did that by manipulating people and getting them to think that you couldn't have real democracy in anything but a capitalist society, which was capable of doing anything, of creating these wonderful highways, of making, moving pictures inside everybody's house, of telephones that didn't need cords, of sleek roadsters. I mean, it was consumerist, but at the same time, you inferred that in a funny way, democracy and capitalism went together.
Democracy and capitalism went together.
The World's Fair was an extraordinary success and captured America's imagination. The vision it portrayed was of a new form of democracy, in which business responded to people's innermost desires in a way politicians could never do. But it was a form of democracy that depended on treating people not as active citizens as Roosevelt did, but as passive consumers. Because this, Bernays believed, was the key to control in a mass democracy.
It's not that the people are in charge, but that the people's desires are in charge. The people are not in charge. The people exercise no decision-making power within this environment. So democracy is reduced from something which assumes an active citizenry to the idea of the public as passive consumers. Driven primarily by instinctual or unconscious desire.
So notice how she gets into the car and it's like, she makes this like long out breath, relax, like she's finally at home in her new product, right? And notice how like that little clip didn't tell you anything about the engine or the brakes or the dependability of the car. No, it's about experience. Sell the good night's sleep, not the mattress.
And that if you can in fact trigger those needs and desires, you can get what you want from them.
But this struggle between the two views of human beings as to whether they were rational or irrational was about to be dramatically affected by events in Europe.
Side note, I'd love to interview this guy, Edwin for this channel. That'd be awesome in the future, just as a note.
Events that would also change the fortunes of the Freud family.
Yeah. Now we're talking World War II.
In March 1938, the Nazis annexed Austria. It was called the Anschluss. Hitler arrived in Vienna to an extraordinary outpouring of mass adulation. But even as he drove through the city, behind the scenes, the Nazis were systematically whipping up and unleashing the hatred of the crowd against the enemies of the new Greater Germany.
The Anschluss was a kind of explosion of terrible hatred against the enemies, the so-called enemies, or whatever they considered enemies, against the Jews totally, and also against a lot of very decent Austrians who had opposed the Nazis in Austria. They said it's legitimate now, you can do what you want, so they did it. Stealing, robbing and killing, I can't say it otherwise. And human depravity, of course, is always very near to normal behavior. It can change very quickly.
As the violence and assassinations raged in Vienna, Freud decided he had to leave. His aim was to go to Britain, but he knew that Britain, like many countries, was refusing entry to most Jewish refugees. But help came from the leading psychoanalyst in Britain, Ernest Jones. He was in the same ice skating club as the Home Secretary, Sir Samuel Hoare, and Jones persuaded Hoare to issue Freud a British work permit. And in May 1938, Freud, his daughter Anna, and other members of his family set off for London. Freud arrived in London as Britain was preparing for war, and he settled with his daughter Anna in a house in Hampstead. But Freud's cancer was now far advanced, and in September 1939, just 3 weeks after the outbreak of war, he died. The Second World War would utterly transform the way governments saw democracy and the people they governed. Next week's program will show how the American government, as a result of the war, became convinced there were savage, dangerous forces hidden inside all human beings, forces that needed to be controlled. The terrible evidence from the death camps seemed to show what happened when these forces were unleashed.
Rough footage.
And politicians and planners in post-war America would come to believe that hidden under the surface of their own population were the same dangerous forces.
That's real footage from World War II.
And they would turn to the Freud family to help control this enemy within. And ever adaptable, Edward Bernays would work not just for the American government, but the CIA. And Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna, would also become powerful in the United States, because she believed that people could be taught to control the irrational forces within them.
All right.